Hello friends, welcome to this new session of Soil Science and Technology, and in this session we will be starting a new topic, that is soil classification and taxonomy. And let us start this new topic, and in this session we will be covering these following concepts. First of all, we will be covering why classification is needed, and secondly we will be discussing what are the different developments of classification systems, and then we will be discussing different classes, and we will be finally giving the description of individual classes. So, always it comes to our mind that why we need a soil classification and taxonomy. Well, you know that classification always allows scientists to accurately identify individual soil wherever they are. And secondly, taxonomy provides basic understanding about the components of different soils, which is necessary for effective decision making about conservation and sustainable use. So, to get a holistic idea about the soil physicochemical processes, you need to have a complete idea about its classification and in which group it belongs, what are their characteristics, and how it differs from other soil groups. So, that is why we need soil classification and taxonomy, just like any other organism in the world. So, what are the purposes of soil classification? There are 5 major purposes of soil classification. First of all, to organize our knowledge. Secondly, to remember properties of the objects. Thirdly, to bring out and understand relationship among individuals and classes of the populations. To learn new relationship among the groups, and establish groups of the objects in a manner useful for practical and applied purposes. So, what I have told you in the previous slide, it reiterates the same. That means you have to organize your knowledge of soil with the help of this soil classification system, and it will help you to identify and remember the properties of soil, and it will help you to understand what are the relationship among these individual soils and what are the classes of the population, and it will help you to identify new relationships among the groups, and finally it will establish groups of objects in a matter. So, it will give you some measurable, it will give you idea of a soil in terms of soil, some measurable properties. So, that is most important. So, let us see the historical development of soil classification. So, earlier system of soil classification, there were a couple of types, 5 different types I have mentioned here. First of all, economic classification, then physical classification, chemical classification, geological classification, and physiographic classification. And these economic classification mainly classified the soil based on tax purposes, and other revenue purposes. And this physical classification basically classified the soil based on soil texture and structure, which had direct link to the soil productivity. So, it basically classified the soil based on soil texture, which had direct relationship with soil fertility. The chemical classification was based on the fact that soil can be divided into groups based on their chemical characteristics, such as acid soils, sodic soils. So, the acidic soils are those soils which have pH of value of less than 7, whereas sodic soils are those soils which are having a high concentration of sodium ions, and both of them are problematic soil. We will discuss them in details later on. So, the chemical classification based on chemically dividing the soil into certain groups. Now, geological classification, as I have already discussed in my previous lectures, of soil formation, that based on the location of the parent material, we divided the soil into sedentary soil and transported soil. So, geological classification was based on the location of parent materials mainly, whereas physiographic classification based on different physical landforms where soil basically occurs. So, physiographic, some of the examples of physiographic classes were mountain soils and so on and so forth, plainland soil and so on and so forth. So, all this classification was each of this classification was based upon certain criteria. Now, problem with certain criteria is it is not holistic. So, based on the chemical characteristics, you cannot divide all the soils of the world. So, you need to develop some kind of holistic classification system which can take into account all the soil properties. So, that is why people soil scientists started to think about what could be the most appropriate way to classify the soil. So, as far as the soil classification is concerned, the first classification modern classification was given by a Russian scientist named Dokuchev in the year 1870, and he is considered as the father of soil pedology, and he was the one who first considered soil as a natural body. Before that, soil was considered as a weathered mantle of rocks. So, he is the first one who established the notion that soil can be considered as a natural body. Now, as you know that soil is highly heterogeneous into the field, and some soil contains some profiles, and some soil, those profiles may not be present in other soils. So, to compare the soil or to describe the soil, we need to have certain kind of measurable entity. So, Dokuchev first said that soil should be considered as a natural body. So, he divided the soil into basic three categories. One is called normal, another is called transitional, another is abnormal. Now, normal soil, so the normal soil, now we know this normal soil as zonal soils. So, earlier he given the name normal soil. So, normal soil basically formed due to the influence of climate and vegetation, and transitional soils, now they are known as intrazonal soils. They are more developed than azonal. So, before that we discussed azonal soils. So, abnormal, third category was abnormal soil. Now we term those abnormal soil as azonal soils. Now, azonal soils are very poorly developed soils. So, you cannot see any well defined horizonation in those soils. So, these soils are called abnormal soils. So, transitional soils are more developed than azonal soils, and formation of these transitional soils are controlled by local factors like parent material and topography. As you know, these are important factors of soil formation, as we have already discussed the Scinece soil formation equation or formula. So, Dokuchev first divided these, Dokuchev first divided soil into three categories. and you see that the classification which was proposed by Dokuchev was based on climate and vegetation. So, based on so that is why it is called genetic system of soil classification. And again, this approach was based on principle of soil genesis. So, role of vegetation on climate was very much important, and that is why this system given by Dokuchev was known as genetic system of soil classification. So, before we go to the next classification system, it needs to we need to discuss some important terms. So, one of these term is called Pedon. Now, as I have already told you that soil is a natural body, and in the landscape one soil differs from other soil in a because soil is very much heterogeneous. So, we need some basic unit of soil classification, or we need some smallest sampling unit. Based on that, we can differentiate one soil at a particular point to other soil at a other at to another soil from other point. So, then this term Pedon came. So, Pedon is basically basic unit of soil classification, and it is the smallest sampling unit that displays the full range of properties which are characteristics of a particular soil. And obviously, one Pedon can be described by this imaginary three-dimensional structure, and as you can see, all these individual horizons are present here, which you have already discussed in the last class. So, remember that Pedon is a three-dimensional entity, and it is the smallest sampling unit that displays the full range of properties, characteristics of a particular soil, and generally a Pedon occupies generally varies from 1 to 10 square meter of land area. So, now let us discuss another important term called polypedon. So, a soil unit in a land, polypedon is basically a soil unit in the landscape which is usually consists of a group of very similar pedons. So, pedon is singular term, whereas whether there are several pedons occurs in a very close proximity, collectively we call them polypedon. Now, remember that polypedon is also known as soil individual. So, polypedon is sufficient size to be recognized as a landscape component. So, as you can see here, this is a landscape, and from this landscape we can take out a individual section which is basically a polypedon or soil individual, which is basically a collection of individual pedons, and from that we can magnify or we can segregate individual pedon, which is a three-dimensional body. So, a polypedon or soil individual is the same kind of thing. However, a polypedon is basically the collection of similar pedons. All right. So, Dokuchev gave the genetic system of classification, which was the first classification system, but there were a couple of problems. First of all, it was in Russian language, and people were skeptic about this type of genetic classification. So, it was first this scientist called Marbut in United States or USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, who adopted the proposed system of Dokuchev, and he gave a system called morphogenetic system, and this system is based on both soil morphology and soil genesis. So, that is why it is called morphogenetic system, and he was the first to introduce the concept of great soil groups, and he gave the classification based on their own intrinsic property. As I have told you, it is a morphogenetic system. Now, morphology is basically showing their own intrinsic properties. So, these were considered as important aspects for classifying the soil. And remember that the highest category was divided into two classes. He gave the name pedalfers and pedocals. Now, pedalfers are basically aluminum and iron accumulation. Those soils which are highly leached soils due to high weathering, and you will see aluminum and iron accumulation is there. So, he gave the name pedalfers for those soils. Another class he gave, it is called pedocals, which is basically soils of arid and semi-arid region, and they show the calcium carbonate accumulation. So, this is called Marbutt's morphogenetic system, but this system was based on assumption of soil genesis which could not find places for most of the soils. So, that was the major drawback for Marbutt's morphogenetic system. So, Marbutt's morphogenetic system was later revised by Baldwin, Kellogg and Thorpe, 3 scientists, and later. So, they also modified this genetic system and morphogenetic system. So, they emphasized the Marbutt system and returned back to the zonality concept. Now, zonality concept you remember given by Dokuchev in their genetic system of soil classification. So, Baldwin and their associate moved back to this zonality concept, and they emphasized on soil as a 3-dimensional body, and they introduced the concept of soil family between great soil group and soil series. We will discuss this name later on, and the concept of great soil group was further revised. So, these soil family, soil series and great soil group, we will discuss this later on when we will be discussing the soil classification, soil taxonomy. Now, but still this system was also not completely based on soil measurable properties. So, all these systems starting from Dokuchev genetic system, then Marbutt's morphogenetic system, and then Baldwin associate genetic system, all these systems they did not highly rely on measurable soil properties. So, that was the major drawback of all these systems. And so, the Baldwin and other associate, they classified the soil into 3 categories. One is zonal or normal soil. Now, normal soil, it was the name given by Dokuchev. Then intrazonal soils and azonal soils. Now, zonal soils are basically the soils where you can see the the dominance of climate for soil genesis. So, it is an important, and soil in the is in equilibrium with the climate and vegetation. So, these soils are called zonal soils or normal soils. Now, azonal soils are too young, dry and sandy to have developed into zonal soils. So, these are basically similar to the earlier abnormal soils given by Dokuchev. And finally, intrazonal soils, which are which are intermediate between zonal soils and azonal soils. So, these soils shows the impact of local conditions like topography and parent material, and in this soil salts, wetness and limestone bedrocks, all these overwhelms the soil genesis. So, these are the 3 major classes given by Baldwin and their associates, and let me show you a couple of examples of these soils. So, as you can see here, these are some examples of zonal soils or normal soils. So, this is an example of podzol which develops in the cool climate and in coniferous forest. and this is xerism, which is desert region soil or desert soils. This is lateritic soil, which occurs in red and these are basically red tropical soils, and this is called brunisms, which are tall grass prairie soils. So, all these soils represents the zonal soils or normal soils, which shows the influence of climate for their soil genesis. For example, Pedons shows the importance of their cool climate, and then laterite shows the importance of warm and humid climate, and these desert soils or xerisms shows the impact of this hot and arid climate, and these brunisms, they shows the impact of vegetations. So, all these are showing the impact of soil climate and vegetations. Now, let us see some examples of intrazonal soils. These are some intrazonal soil examples are rendzinas, which are shallow to limestone bedrocks. You can see these are two examples here, and clay soils are wet soils, and claying is a property of wet soil, and finally peat soil, which is an organic soil. So, these intrazonal soils are dominated by the local characteristics. As you can see here, the rendzinas are dominated by the limestone, which is the local property, and then clay soils are dominated by wetness, which is another local property, and peat soils is dominated by high organic matter, which is also a local property. So, these are the examples of intrazonal soils. Finally, let us see the azonal soils or abnormal soils. So, these are too young soils to be developed into a true zonal soil. For example, as you can see, dry sandy soil, as you can see here, and shallow to bedrock soils and alluvial soils. So, all these are young parent material, as you can see. So, you in all these soils you will not see these are shallow to bedrock soils, and this is dry sandy soils. So, these soils you will not see a proper soil horizonation, or in other words, soil horizons are not easily visible. So, there is no properly developed master horizons. So, that is why they are called young soils or poorly developed soils. So, these are examples of azonal soils. So, what are the major limitations of the genetic systems? So, the major limitations were the two highest categories were defined in genetic terms, not on soil properties. And the great soil group concept was qualitative. Again, this is not quantitative. In definitions, more emphasis was given to properties of virgin soil, which got modified by the use. And the nomenclature was evolved for many languages, and it was very much difficult to name the intergrades. So, these were some inherent problems or drawbacks of the genetic system. That is why there was a pressing need for development of a more scientific and more comprehensive system of soil classification. And this was given in the year 1975 by United States Department of Agriculture in collaboration with National Cooperative Soil Survey under the leadership of G.D. Smith, and this is called soil taxonomy. And this is the most widely used soil classification system nowadays, which is followed in almost 50 countries. So, this soil taxonomy again given by United States Department of Agriculture, and this is called a comprehensive system of soil classification, because it has got several properties. First of all, it is system based on the measured or observed soil property. Earlier the properties were qualitative in nature. However, now the soil taxonomy based on measurable soil property. It help it based on the surface and subsurface diagnostic horizons. and it considers the moisture and temperature regime of the soil. It considers color, texture, structure. It considers it considers organic matter, clay, iron, aluminum oxide, silicate clay, salts, pH, base saturation, soil depth. So it is a holistic system which consider all the important soil properties for distributing soil into some homogeneous groups. So, if you see soil taxonomy, it is a kind of it is a hierarchical system of soil classification, and you will see there are 6 different levels. At the bottom we call it soil series, followed by soil family, followed by subgroup, followed by grade group, then suborder and order. So, the lowest category is soil series and the highest category is soil order. And as you can see, there are 12 soil orders which you can see in the soil. We will discuss them later on one by one. So, similarly, just like any organism can be classified based on their kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus and species, any soil can be classified based on these levels. And as you can see, there are total 19,000 series and 8,000 family, 1,400 subgroups, 250 grade groups, suborder and 63 suborders and 12 orders. So, any soil can be differentiated into, or any soil can be grouped into using this hierarchical system of soil taxonomy. So, let us wrap up here, and from in the next session we will be discussing different properties which the soil taxonomy considers for classifying the soils. What are the epipedons, what are the endopedons, and what is the soil moisture regime, what is soil temperature regimes, and then what are different soil orders and what are their properties. So, we will be discussing them in the next session. Thank you.